And now, click once and you're in.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm William Burke, and today we're going to talk about how you can tie Appref MS into your offensive operations. So we'll kick things off with a real quick introduction, and then from there we'll give some background and some context as to what pushed us to do this research in the first place. From there, I'll give an overview of ClickOnce as a whole and how Appref MS ties into that. And then we'll talk about how you can tie Appref MS into your phishing campaigns and use it for some other things such as your C2 management. After that, we'll do a little bit of talking about how it fits in the defensive side of the house in terms of how, what you can look out for there. And then if we have time, we'll wrap up with some questions as well. So as for myself, as mentioned, William Burke. Now, thankfully, this briefing template has a gigantic picture of me up there, so you know this isn't some grand social engineering experiment, but I've got about 15 years across the Intel world and InfoSec world with a military background, private sector, and then currently working in the public sector with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, as a red team lead there. I also do course development and education at Marymount University as an adjunct graduate professor there. So the end of the golden age. And what I'm referring to here is way back when, and we're talking about InfoSec time here, so that's about 4 years ago. It was much more difficult comparatively to do phishing and get that initial code execution compared to today. So back then, you could, for example, just take a PowerShell one-liner, throw it in a bat file, drop it in a Word doc as OLE, and then some console on the other side of the wire will open that right up for you and then give you initial access in their host. But as time ticked on, things got a little more difficult to actually get that code execution. So Windows Defender got better. Antivirus got a bit better at detecting when things are coming through. Even things like Gmail can detect a malicious attachment or link right when it's attached in or right when it's sent. So there were a lot more barriers to success in order to actually get that code execution on the other side. So we needed a new method to get that code execution that didn't get those blocks that the older methods tend to do these days. So we needed something that can work on Windows 7 fully patched, Windows 10 fully patched, because those are typically the systems we'll land on out in the wild. It had to be completely patched up. Defender had to be enabled. Antivirus, we tested a couple of those as well and make sure it got past those. And we looked at a couple different methods to get that execution, and we each have our preference. Personally, I'm very partial to OLEs. I like being able to drop it in a Word doc and have that extra bit of time to really add some additional details to the campaign to entice that end user to really click that attachment. But some people like the hyperlinks, some people like direct attachment, so we kind of worked around a couple different things to see what we could do from there. And the big focus of what we were looking for here was the actual execution of the code, the delivery of the code. Now, what was being sent, the payload, needed to be able to be swappable. So we need to be able to change what payload we're sending, but still have a reliable delivery and execution method to get that code over there. So based on those requirements, where do we really kick things off here? So now, as mentioned, I really like OLEs. I like that additional layer of story crafting that we get with that method. So that was the path that I started going down first. And Matt Nelson had some relatively recent research on that. So digging through that, I started looking at how he discovered the setting content MS file type and was able to leverage that for OLEs, and kind of started working down a somewhat similar path in terms of that initial research. So I took the list of OLEs that are, the file types that are blocked as OLEs, and then spun up a fresh Win10 image and worked through and started cross-referencing what types of file types are permitted as OLEs and which ones have any kind of interest to me, and then what is actually the engine that runs them whenever these file types are executed. So I worked that down to a relatively smaller list compared to that initial list of ones that I was interested in, ones that seem that they have some potential in terms of getting that code execution. And then as I started digging a little deeper into them individually, kind of hit Appref MS. Appref MS is used to deploy and run remote web applications and contains a local remote link to an application commonly used to enable links from Windows Start menu. So this kind of told me that there might be something there. So this was kind of a hit for me in terms of the research path I was going down. So based on that, I'm going to do a little more digging and find out if there's any prior research on this. And for Appref MS specifically, I couldn't find any prior research on this being used in a malicious context. So I found a couple old blog posts, a couple different things referencing it in terms of operations or what it is, but I couldn't find any actual malicious use. Now, ClickOnce, which is that bigger picture thing that runs Appref MS, there was some really good research on ClickOnce in particular. So NetSpy, SixDub, BoHops, they had some really, really good write-ups on ClickOnce, but the write-ups that they had focused on leveraging ClickOnce to do online-only running of applications via a .application link, which is no longer permitted as a OLE. And what I wound up going down was a very different aspect of that ClickOnce research. Now, ultimately, the success was met. So we were able to meet our goals. We got not only the methods of execution, but also found out some other really cool things just from tinkering around that we're actually able to leverage this for as well. So, kind of talked a bit about Appref MS a couple times here, but how does that actually fit in to the bigger picture of things? So, let me ClickOnce real quick. Now, say you're your average run-of-the-mill developer, and you have an application that you want to publish out. So you can push that out to an internal share, external share, whatever the case might be. But when you decide to publish your application, you're going to publish it as online only or online or offline type of availability. And that becomes important a little bit down the road once you start talking about how Appref MS comes in this in particular. But once it's published, the root directory of wherever you publish it to will have these sets of files. So the publish.htm is basically a landing page. The .application file helps ClickOnce know where to go to run the actual application. Setup.exe is a generic installer, and then the application files folder has all of the supporting files for the application itself. So once this is published out, your average run-of-the-mill end user could then go to either that publish.html or .htm, pull that file down, and then run the application. They can run the setup.exe. There's a whole lot of options. It kind of becomes choose your own adventure at that point in terms of how you actually want to get that application to run. So another key thing to point out is that when they go to run that application, they'll always get the latest version of the application. So as you make updates to the application, when they go and pull it down and fire it off, they'll get whatever the latest version is. So a little bit ago I mentioned the online only versus online or offline type of availability in terms of when you publish it. So if it is online only, when they run the application, they'll be prompted with a run button. If it's online or offline, they get prompted with an install button. And we'll talk about the differences why in just a minute. But basically what it boils down to here is that both of those run that application. They only have to click the run or install button one time, and then the rest of the application will do its own thing from there. And another note is that once they approve the installation of this application, when you're using online or offline availability, any updates that you push, which can be forced updates, will no longer require approval from the end user to execute. And that's pretty much that. So we have our method of getting the application deployed, and while I was setting up my lab images and working through Win 10, I went to install Chrome and noticed that Internet Explorer Chrome was installed through Internet Explorer by a ClickOnce deployment package. So just setting up the lab, I came across a real-world example where ClickOnce is actually used to get things executed. So that's cool and all, but how does Appref MS specifically actually tie into all this, right? So as mentioned, we have that online only and online or offline availability. Now, in online only, it pulls those files to a temp directory, fires it off one time. It's meant to be a single time use. And then if you want to run the application again, you can rerun the .application, wherever the case might be. But typically with the online only, it's meant to be short-term use, like single time run kind of situation. However, in online or offline, that's meant to be for more persistent usage. So you're running it somewhat regularly. And in that instance, it not only pulls the files down to a temp directory and fires off the application, but it does make two pretty significant changes as well. So one thing is it adds, as part of the installation process, it adds a registry key under the uninstall tree so that the end user would be able to go to the uninstall GUI and then use that to uninstall the application. And also it adds a shortcut, a application reference file or Appref MS file under a folder in the user start menu. So these are some pretty noticeable changes, but we'll talk about those in just a minute. But specifically regarding Appref MS here, once the Appref MS, which you can kind of think is a shortcut to the application, once the Appref MS file is executed, based on how it's configured when the application is deployed, it can be set so that it checks into the deployment server, sees if there are any updates to the application. If there are updates, it can be configured to force the installation of said updates to the application, then execute it from there. And if there are any missing files or anything along those lines, it'll pull all those down as well. So if we send an Appref MS file via email, OLE, whatever the case might be, and someone else executes it, then the Appref MS file will notice that there's no application like this here. Let me take care of that for you. I've got your back. Now, the end user will still need to approve the execution, but once they do that first initial approval, everything runs from there, once again, including any updates past that. So how can we leverage this in phishing campaigns? Now, as mentioned, the actual payload itself is going to be very case dependent, very malleable. And the focus of what we're looking for here was the execution and the delivery of the code. Now, we have our series of payloads that we use in our ops, and so I used one of those for testing, and it was successful. Now, another thing to point out, though, is that for testing purposes, I do have a code signing cert. So if you don't have a code signing cert and you're using this out in the wild, then you may run into Windows Smart Screen. So that's one thing to consider as well in terms of leveraging this in your operations and how you do things. However, if you deploy the application internally, which is kind of a whole separate talk, but if you do deploy it internal to their organization, there's no need for code signing certs, and it's automatically trusted. And then lastly, I mentioned those two things that I don't like, that it pops that uninstall key, registry key, and that it populates those files. So we went through and modified the payload so that as part of the application deployment process, it goes back and cleans those things out so they never actually populate or be visible or are visible to the end user in the first place. And I had example code for that in the white paper that I submitted, so feel free to go take a look at that to see what that proof of concept code looks like. So once you've got all that in place and you're good to go, so you've got your payload, you got your cleanup, etc., you need to actually deploy that application. Now, a key thing here, and this is where things kind of pivoted in a different direction compared to the prior ClickOnce research, was that we're going to publish as make it available offline and online and offline as well. And for Appref MS, that has to be selected because the installation process doesn't take place for online only, and you need that Appref MS file to execute the things we're looking to do. So, so we publish as online and offline, and then you can arbitrarily set whatever version number you want to set. So digging into the options from there, you can specify the application should check for updates. It should check before the application starts. And here's the minimum version number that we want to be ran on this system. And that in particular comes into play once we start talking about that C2 management side of the house. So I'll pause on that for now. But that being said, you still need an Appref MS file to send. Now, you could just deploy it and then copy and paste it out of the shortcut that populates there. But like I just said, we clean up after ourselves so that never hits in the first place. So to save time of trying to deploy, redeploy, modify code, etc., we can just make our own. So there are 4 things that you're going to need. You need the name of the application, the token, the culture, and the architecture of the application. And you can basically just put all that together in line with a URL to the actual application file itself, as you can see here. And that's all the information you need. Now that information is in the .application file, which you can find in the application files on the deployment folder. So not too much digging is necessarily involved, but once you have that data, save it single line. You have to save it as UTF-16 little endian format, or else it won't work, and it won't tell you why it's not working. That one was an absolute pain to work through. But once you have that there, save it off as an Appref MS, and then you're good to go. And that's it. Simple, right? So now we can throw this out. We have our Appref MS file. We have our application deployed, and it's ready for delivery. So when it comes to testing, the first thing I'm going to look at is the laziest way. Can I throw it directly in email as an attachment? And the answer is yes. So dropping the Appref MS file directly into Gmail for sending, delivery, receipt, execution, at no point in that process was it ever flagged. And to circle back though, I really like OLEs. Now that's what kind of drove this research in the first place, so that's what I really wanted to dig into personally. So we took a look at that. And so we took the Appref MS file, dropped it in the Word document as an OLE, and just like every other method, so the document was delivered, it was received, opened, executed, and had no problem. So just like every other OLE, they need to click Run to actually run the package, and then they get prompted with that ClickOnce install option, and the second they click that, we have C2. We're good to go, we're established. Now, I know that the majority of people here probably have seen OLEs in action and know what they look like and everything along those lines, but I want to show you what the Appref MS side of the house looks like from the end user's perspective. So going through and pulling down the Word document, and this is on the quote-unquote end user's side of the house. So as with every other type of OLE delivery, they need to enable content up at the top, and then when they scroll down, they'll see the package itself, the Appref MS package. And when they double-click that, you'll see a quick blip in the top left corner of the screen. And that blip is ClickOnce reaching out to the deployment server to say, hey, does this application exist? And it did, so it comes back with that ClickOnce prompt. Do you want to run this? And then, boom, evil calculators. So that being said, that's just two examples. There's a lot of other things you can tie Appref MS into. It's very malleable as a delivery format. So for example, you can combine it with other methods to do things like delivery via HTA and a couple other ways. However, at that point it's kind of extraneous since it's ultimately still delivering the ClickOnce application, which can be directly delivered, can be directly dropped as an OLE, but feel free to play around with and experiment with that a bit. And similarly, you can also tie Appref MS into lateral movement capabilities. Now, once again, whatever your preferred method is, you can try to find a way to work it in there. I just have two very high-level ones here, just as examples to kind of get the gears turning a little bit. But the first one is that as you're moving throughout an environment, if you have the permissions, capabilities, etc., you can laterally push the Appref MS file to a remote startup folder. So the next time that system boots up, it'll fire off the Appref MS and establish C2. And then similarly, you can use psexec to invoke dfshim.dll, which will also run the ClickOnce side of the application and then install things that way. Now, in either of these circumstances and however other methods you choose to employ, the one time will still be at play where the end user has to approve that. So keep the social engineering aspect of that at play if you want to leverage this, because it's not as quiet as other methods, but this really helps tie into the C2 side of the house in terms of separating your typical opt chain from other methods of establishing the C2 itself. So once again, keep social engineering at play. If you do, for example, something like the startup menu or startup folder, then maybe name the application something like Windows boot help.exe, something like that. So that way it kind of ties in. It doesn't seem too out of place when the user runs it. But once they do run that initial application, then they're good to go from there. Which kind of brings us into the whole C2 management side of this thing. So when it comes to C2 management, now in ops, we tend to have what we call separate lanes of communication. In different lanes, we use different TTPs, different domains, things like that, so that if one of our areas gets burned out and we're pushed out of the network, then we still have other methods of maintaining that access. And then we'll also have lifelines, and then lifelines are very, very low and slow, so like might beacon out once every couple of days, one time just to check in type of C2 traffic. Now, when it comes to the ops side of the house, everyone has those bad days where they get burned out. They're detected, they run through everything, find your stuff, burn you out of the network, right? And that's when those lifelines come into play. However, tinkering and playing around with things a little bit, we noticed that we can actually leverage Appref MS as a lifeline itself in a way. So since it has that capability to force check updates, and if there are updates, force the installation and execution of said updates, then we can actually use the Appref MS file as a C2 management type of tool. So basically, if you're ever burned out, you have these completely benign, so they literally do nothing malicious, no payloads or anything, completely benign applications, Appref MS, that are set on a timer. And then it could be an hour, a day, a week. For the example of this demonstration, 1 minute. But every time it runs, whether it's on a scheduled task or on boot, whatever the case might be, every time it runs, it's going to check into that server to see if there's any new updates. And once again, it's a completely benign, there's nothing there type of application, so there's nothing to be flagged in terms of malicious activity that this is doing. And since ClickOnce is a trusted Windows way of executing things, it's not suspicious of this activity either. Now, you have your average, everyday, run-of-the-mill operator, just up there doing operator things, and as mentioned, boom, defense caught on, pushed out of the network, bad day for everybody. But as we're moving through, whether it was through phishing delivery or lateral movement push, whatever the case might be, at the bottom there, we have a Appref MS file on a timer. Once again, nothing malicious. It's literally just a do-nothing application that is set to execute, but it checks for those updates whenever it does execute. Now that we're burned out, we don't have access anymore. All we need to do is push an update to that deployment server, and the next time that Appref MS file checks in, it'll download, execute, and run the updated application, reestablishing us in the network. And based off of that, as you're moving through, however many types of hosts you drop the Appref MS file to, as they independently check in, they'll all be pulling down that new malicious update. And then likewise, once you have your C2 established, if you want, you can flip that back to a non-malicious new update. So then if anyone else tries to follow up and see what's going on, there's nothing malicious there for them to detect. So as an example of this, so on the bottom side, left corner, you'll notice a quick blip. And then once again, that's the Appref MS file checking into the server to see if there's anything there. So I saw it check in, so I go ahead and change it from that do nothing application to our evil calculators application. When I deploy this, it deploys it to the publishing server, publishes it to the deployment server over FTP, pushes everything up, and then it confirms to me and shows the publish.html page to confirm that the application was successfully deployed. So once it's deployed, we can see the publish.html, we know we're good to go, and the next time one of these hosts check in, it'll say, okay, well, you have an update. You know, there's something new there that wasn't there before, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that new version of the application and execute that. However, since the initial execution of the application was approved, no further updates were required to get that code execution for the follow-up. So you can have something completely benign initially, and then whenever you're ready, you can push something malicious and then get your code execution on that host. So, defense. Now, in terms of Appref MS itself, everything that we're doing, we're definitely abusing the way that it's meant to be used. However, we're using it as it's intended to be used as well. So there's nothing here that we're doing that is outside of the normal scope of ClickOnce usage in terms of how it pulls things, executes things, etc. We're just abusing how we get it to do it because it would be pretty uncommon to just send an Appref MS file to somebody. And then, once again, in terms of abusing the method of updates and how we push those updates to the applications to switch from benign to malicious, etc., those are, once again, abuses, but it's still doing what it's intended to do in terms of pulling those things and running those things. Now, so internal to your organization, you certainly have the option to just block any Appref MS activity. That's one way to stop this from executing in your environment. However, there may be legitimate use cases to have ClickOnce applications, Appref MS, etc., going on in your organization. So it may be something you want to monitor to see if it's executing, but that's once again a thing that you might want to look at internally. The second big thing is, as mentioned, when it does the installation process, it creates a registry key. We go back through, we clean that up afterwards, but those are still actions in registry that could be detectable as indicators of compromise. And then lastly, training end users not to click things, not to run things. They should start recognizing things like that, where if they open up a Word document and double click what they think is a schedule or something along those lines and suddenly get prompted to install things, those are things that people should be wary about. However, in most cases, in the red team side of the house specifically, we tend to look for people like HR, people with recruitment, people who are used to just working with people external in the organization, running these things, and just trying to move on to the next person, et cetera. So it can be very difficult to get people trained up, but that's going to always be the weakest link in terms of getting that code execution. So helping people get trained up, and especially when they're just trying to do their jobs, will be beneficial as well. And then lastly, even though ClickOnce itself runs clean, everything else related to ClickOnce there, in terms of that actual execution, we still need a payload that is executed by this Appref MS file. So the post-exploitation, beaconing traffic, any other kind of file movements, et cetera, those are things that you would still want to look out for. Then lastly, in regards to our takeaways here, so the first thing I really want to point out is that Appref MS is a good addition to any operator's tool belt. So there's a lot of different things you can do with it. It's very malleable as a delivery method. So whether you're using it for phishing, lateral movement, C2 management, et cetera, feel free to tinker with it and see how you can tie it into the way that you do your operations. And speaking of tinkering, always feel free to push things to that next step to see what can I do with this. Because initially when we were doing this research, I just wanted something that I could send an OLE with again and get us back in that system. However, we're actually able to tie it into other methods, once again, lateral movement, C2, and found some additional really cool uses for Appref MS that weren't out there before. And then lastly, I just wanted to also bring awareness to the use of Appref MS and just make everyone aware that, especially on the defense side, that things like this do exist and to keep an eye out for it and then watch from there and hopefully find that in the future. So last thing I want to point out is we're at the end of the time here, so I won't have time for questions here. However, I will be at the speaker wrap-up room and I'm more than happy to talk with anyone there after this if you have any questions from there. Thank you.